Alright everybody, welcome back. This is my second response to the corruption video I posted a while back. I have a Muslim who responded to the first of the 5 points that I listed, and the first of the 5 points was simply to define corruption. Now the definition here, quote, I will define corruption as adding, subtracting, or changing the wording of a text. Now very curiously, the individual who wrote this comment, I asked some follow-up questions, and it seems that the comment means or implies intentional changes. Now, whether they're intentional or unintentional, a change is a change. I'm not sure what relevance that has to text-critical scholars. I don't agree with this definition for numerous reasons, but I won't go into those. In this video, I'm going to show why this definition of corruption is a very bad definition for a Muslim to adopt, and I'm going to demonstrate why this definition of corruption, like so many other polemics that Muslims put out against Christianity, actually turns around to bite you. I have no better way to explain it. Just like Deuteronomy 18, John 14, these allegations of corruption are very soon going to come back and be the nightmares of Muslims. And here's the reason for this, and I'm going to elaborate on this more in depth throughout the second part of this video and then at the end. For centuries, Islam has isolated itself from criticism, and I mean this in the common sense, obviously, but also in the academic sense, where criticisms, you have scholarly disciplines of criticism, historical criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism, form criticism, etc., and yes, text criticism. Now, Muslims have been able to claim that their manuscripts of the Quran are perfectly preserved from Uthman. So they have the actual manuscripts of the Quran that Uthman commissioned, sent out. They have those, and they are perfectly preserved, and there are no variants between the manuscripts. Now, that's what Muslims have been able to claim, and nobody has been able to falsify this claim because the texts themselves are not open for scholarly inquiry. And we're going to see a very specific example of a particular Islamic scholar who claimed just that. He said, we have, and I'll show you the quote very soon, we have, he says the copies of some of the Qurans that Uthman sent out have been lost, but 3 remain. And this was his claim for decades, and on his authority, other Muslims would make the same claim. We have these manuscripts that are preserved from Uthman's time. They're intact. You can go look at them, and we're going to find out that that is not the case. And so there have been cases, of course, several decades ago, Arthur Jeffrey. You have Asma Halali. She published her work on the Sauna palimpsest very recently, I think October of 2017. You have Dr. Keith Small's work as well. He published part of his PhD dissertation in a book about textual criticism of the Quran, where he analyzes just a few passages, a whole book on not only passages, just a couple verses, a couple ayat. And then, of course, you have Dan Brubaker's PhD thesis as well. And so there are sources out there for what we've been able to access of the manuscripts of the Quran and analyze. But there's a lot more that's on the horizon. Muslims are now in the calm before the storm. So in this video, I'm going to demonstrate why this definition of corruption is self-refuting, and I'm going to look very specifically at some methods that Islamic scholars have used for text criticism. So I'm going to pull up a copy of Al-Mushaf al-Sharif right here, and you can see, I'll pull my magnifier up here a little bit so you guys can see. This is obviously an Islamic organization, Research Center for Islamic History, and they are examining here the copy, the top copy, so this will be the Topkapi Manuscript, and notice very carefully it says attributed to Uthman. So this would be one of the manuscripts that Muslims have claimed for centuries is complete, goes back to the time of Uthman, and it matches the standardized edition printed by the printer there in Medina. It matches, no textual variants, perfectly preserved, etc. So we're going to look in this article published by Islamic scholars and see how that actually holds up. All right, so let's scroll down a little bit. They keep using very carefully this term attributed to Caliph Uthman. And so this began in 1991. Even these scholars had some issues to overcome before they could get access to this manuscript. So Dr. Altakulich seems to be the foremost researcher here, and some of his credentials, one of the most authoritative scholars on the science of Qira'at, and wanted to compare this manuscript with other mushafs. All right. And this is what I referred to earlier. They compared it to the Holy Quran, which was published the Mus'haf printing house in Medina. Altakulich compared this copy with the Tashkent Mus'haf, also attributed to Caliph Uthman. Very important. Okay, so we have the Topkapi in Istanbul, and then we have the Tashkent manuscript as well. And he added a table indicating the variations between the Mus'hafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. All right, so let's scroll down here a little bit more. One of the most significant characteristics of this Mus'haf is the fact that it is a complete copy, with the exception of 2 missing folios. Well, then it's not a complete copy, is it? You don't get to say it's a complete copy with the exception of the parts that aren't there. Okay, so it's not a complete copy. And in comparison with the other dated copies, the oldest of which was copied in the 3rd century AH. So it doesn't seem like we have any manuscripts going back to Uthman's time. They mention additions. Imagine that, additions to the Quranic manuscripts. Additions in red ink in the beginning of Surat al-Fatiha and Surat al-Baqarah, which were added later. But I thought the Quran was perfectly preserved. That's interesting. The shape of the letters does not conform to the writing style of the early mushafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. And the script, the earlier mushafs, does not contain dots or diacriticals. So they're describing the methods they use to analyze and to date the Topkapi manuscript and determine that the Topkapi Museum Mushaf dates neither from the period when the mushafs of the Caliph Uthman were written, nor from the time when copies based on these mushafs were written. So, contrary to the claims that Muslims have made for centuries, this Topkapi manuscript does not go back to the time of Uthman. That's very interesting. To conclude our remarks, we could judge that the Topkapi Museum Mushaf was not written during the period when the Imam Mushafs were produced and sent to different provinces upon the order of Caliph Uthman. He quotes Ibn Khaldun here, interestingly. Arabic writing at the beginning of Islam was not of the best quality, nor of the greatest accuracy and excellence. It was not even of medium quality, because the Arabs possessed the savage desert attitude and were not familiar with the crafts. Interesting statement. All right, the Arabs later conquered cities and took possession of provinces. Well, that sounds about right. And then they needed the art of writing. At this time, they began writing, and as a result, they achieved a high degree of excellence. Now, I want you to notice this quote very carefully. This Mus'haf is also an excellent manifestation of the message expressed in the verse. Behold, it is we ourselves who have bestowed from on high step by step this reminder, and behold, it is we who shall truly guard it from corruption, quoting Surah 15:9. So, they use this Mus'haf as an example of the praise that's due to Allah because He preserved the manuscript. Now, forget about the 2,270 variants that they go on to note later in this, which I'll show you that part as well. But we're just going to talk about how the Quran is perfectly preserved. And I'm going to point out a very significant flaw in their methodology. All right. He asserts again, notice this, the Holy Quran was read and preserved as it was written by the scribes of Revelation and reached the present day without any distortions, not without any variants, not without any differences, but without any distortions, stated very modestly compared to the average Muslim on the street. Okay, now this guy is a very significant name here. We're going to talk about this guy a little bit. Although the Tashkent Mus'haf was also published by Professor Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah with a brief introduction, we cannot consider it as sufficient evidence of the authenticity of the sacred text, since 2/3 of it was missing. All right, so remember that name because we're going to come back to it. Now, it's also significant, notice the self-serving statement, that no other book on earth has been copied, published, read, or studied as much as the Holy Quran. Okay, how about the Torah? All right, it's got a 1,500-year head start. And here is something, let me make this point as well. It's significant that no other book on earth has been copied, published, read, or studied as much as the Quran. The Quran has only, until very recent decades, been studied by Islamic scholars. They have not opened their manuscripts up for inquiry from other scholars. Okay? So this is such just a self-serving statement. The Muslims have kept their manuscripts, locked up, only available to Islamic scholars who try for a decade to get access to them. Yet, no other book on earth has been studied as much as the Quran. You got to be kidding me. Okay, so the Tashkent Mus'haf represented only 1/3 of the original copy. I thought the Quran was perfectly preserved. Moreover, as will be explained below, some unintentional alterations were made on this copy. Now, notice this statement. They were going to make a critical edition of the two Mus'hafs, but it would not yield a healthy result, as it was missing 2/3 of the text and had been tampered with. Imagine if New Testament text critics adopted this method. Okay, so what Altikulich is saying here is that they have the Topkapi Manuscript, and then they have the Tashkent Manuscript. And if they compare the two, it won't yield a, healthy result. And so they say, well, we're not going to do that. Because they want, it wouldn't be conducive to the concept of perfect preservation of the Quran. Now, imagine, again, a New Testament text critic comparison. A New Testament textual critic has Codex Sinaiticus, beautifully preserved from the 4th century, early 4th century, and they want to compare it to another manuscript. And so they get the other manuscript, and they want to make a text critical apparatus. And they look at the two manuscripts, and they say, well, Sinaiticus it's great. It's complete. It's beautifully preserved. It's very ancient. Yet this other manuscript over here, only 1/3 of it has been preserved, and the part that has been preserved has been tampered with. And if we compare these two, it's really not going to look very good, so we're just not going to do that. Imagine if that's how text criticism worked for the New Testament. By the way, I thought Allah perfectly preserved the Quran. What about the Tashkent manuscript? Did he just forget about that one? Did he forget about the 2/3 that was lost and just forget to preserve the 1/3 that remained that was actually tampered with? This is absurd. All right, so they go on further to say, but rather than excluding this copy completely from our study, we tried to present sufficient information and deal with the discussions and evaluations as to whether or not it represents one of the Mus'hafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. Okay, so they're still on the quest for this Mus'haf attributed to Caliph Uthman, a Mus'haf that actually dates to middle of the 7th century, goes back to Uthman's time, so that they can finally show the world, here is our complete, preserved copy of the Quran, which does not exist. All right, so even though, they say it here very plainly, even though we would like to publish this sacred text as the Mus'haf of Caliph Uthman, even though this has been claimed by Muslims for hundreds of years, it was neither the private Mus'haf of Caliph Uthman nor one of the Mus'hafs that he sent to the various centers. So a claim that's been made by Muslims for centuries has just been debunked by Islamic scholars themselves. Once the Islamic texts are open up to criticism, even from other Islamic scholars, they don't pass the test. All right, so let's scroll down a little bit to see what we have next. Here it is again. He keeps repeating this because this has been a dominant claim throughout the Muslim world for a long time. As known by everyone interested in this subject, it has been claimed until recently that the Topkapi Mus'haf was one of the copies attributed to Caliph Uthman. Until recently. Okay, so that claim has been debunked. One of the most important questions of Quranic history is the whereabouts of the Mus'hafs attributed to Caliph Uthman and whether any of them reached the present day. Unfortunately, we do not have a positive answer to this question. In our view, this situation is one of the greatest weaknesses of the Islamic world throughout history. Well, yeah, you claim that your manuscripts are perfectly preserved from the time of Uthman, and you can't find one. So you can't. There's no manuscript evidence to support your claim. So yeah, I would say it's one of the greatest weaknesses of Islam. If you can't provide evidence for one of the primary claims about your text, yeah, that's a significant weakness. I would agree with that. All right, scrolling down a little more, we come to this name again. Until now, we have also believed in the possibility of it being one of the Mushafs of Caliph Uthman. This is talking about the Tashkent again. Late eminent scholar, Professor Muhammad Hamidullah, whose studies have always been beneficial to our work, quotes, "The copies of the Quran, which were sent to the provincial centers by Caliph Uthman, were lost one after the other in the following centuries." So these manuscripts that are supposed to go back to Uthman have been lost, one after the other. At present, a complete copy of one of these mushafs is kept in the Topkapi Palace Museum, so keep track of this. The Topkapi Palace Museum, and a second copy is located at the India Office Library in England. Okay? And the third copy, with a few missing pages, that is a blatant lie. 2/3 of it is gone. A few missing pages is located in Tashkent. Okay, so 3 copies, Topkapi, Tashkent, and one located at the India Office Library in England. All right, so this is the claim that this Dr. Hamidullah makes. Now, what's the truth? Well, they searched for the copy that was claimed to be in England by Dr. Hamidullah, and it was not found in their library. So all of the manuscripts have been lost one by one, except for the 3. The one in the at the India Office Library in England, the Tashkent, and the Topkapi. The one in England in the India Office Library is not there. So there's one down. The Topkapi is not complete. It's missing 2 folios. So there's 2 down, and the Tashkent only has 1/3 remaining. And the other 2/3 have been lost, and the 1/3 that is remaining has been tampered with. So no mushafs go back to the time of Uthman. All right. Now we'll talk a little bit about the perfect preservation here of the Topkapi when they compared it to the standardized copy of the Quran, the standardized print. It says there are 2,270 instances where there is dissimilarity between the Topkapi Mushaf and the Fard Mushaf, most of them concerning whether or not the word was written with an aleph. Okay, and so they go down here and they try to give you some nice, comforting examples. They talk about spelling differences, 780 places, and then 90 places. They discuss some other variants, and then a total of some other insignificant variants that they list 34 times. So if you add these numbers up, you come up with just under 1,000 numbers. So there are 1,270 numbers left, or 1,270 variants left, that they don't want to summarize here for you. They'll go into those later. Now, what are those variants exactly? What are the variants? And how can non-Muslims verify this claim, or the extent of the truth of the claim, that the Quran has been perfectly preserved? Well, you can look at some of the work I mentioned. Arthur Jeffrey. You can look at Keith Small's work. You can look at Asma Halali's work. You can look at Dan Brubaker's work. You can look at Dr. Asanalu and Atakulich's work as well. Or you can just wait, because later this year or at the beginning of next year, there is going to be an online database available for anyone who has internet access and is competent enough to type a web address into their browser. And this database is going to have the variants in the Quran that a group of scholars have cataloged and databased so far. It's about 3,800 variants. And here's the thing, there are pictures with every single one of them. And people are going to be able to go on this website, and they're going to be able to look at charts, look at various statistics about the Quran. They're going to be able to organize variants by surah or variants by chapter, surah, chapter, or ayat. You can go to a specific surah right now or a specific manuscript tradition. You can click on that manuscript tradition and it will auto-populate all of the variants. And again, these charts provide, evidence about where the most of the variants are that have been cataloged. That's the thing to stress. This database is building. And any Muslim who claims that their text has been perfectly preserved will just be able to post a link, go here, and look at your perfectly preserved text with thousands of variants and growing. The scholars will continue to populate this database. Muslims will have their worldview rocked. Muslims who have believed all of their life that there is one Arabic Quran and that there is somewhere a complete manuscript that goes back to Uthman that's been perfectly preserved. They're going to have to take definitions of corruption, like we started this video with, adding, subtracting, or changing the wording of a text. And they're going to be able to go online and look at the tapings in the Quranic manuscripts and look at the coverings and the insertions and the write-overs and the erasures. They'll be able to look at all of this stuff. And they will wonder why their imams and why their scholars have not told them the truth about their manuscripts. And they're going to have to dramatically and drastically rethink their concept of text criticism and rethink their concept of corruption. The isolation that Muslims have been able to maintain, the insulation, the protection of their texts from honest and objective text criticism has crumbled. And for Muslims who aren't familiar with what's coming on the horizon, I suggest you get familiar with it. For Muslims who want to hold to a simplistic and implicit definition of corruption, a change of a word, intentional or not, if that's your definition of corruption, then you better be ready to declare your own Quran corrupted. And there's going to be evidence about why this is the case, and it's going to be available to everyone, and it's going to be very soon. So that's my response here in this second video on the topic of corruption, and why Muslims are going to very soon have to deal with these arguments for the first time in history, as the Quran is coming under great scrutiny in the area of text criticism. Thanks for watching.